And that brings me to my take on Charles Bernstein's work. To quote a line from Charles, he says, "I like my poetry the way I like my fruitcake, nutty." And since today's topic is really about translation, and I think translating Charles is really a nutty case, and I can give you some examples, right? Starting with this anecdote, a few years ago when Charles's book, Pitch of Poetry, was first published, a friend of mine wrote me from China asking me how to translate the title word pitch. But the minute I saw that email, I was like, oh man, I could almost hear this Frenchman by the name of Jacques Derrida, turning in his grave, polysemy. How do you translate? So pardon my French. I wanted to say to my friend, it all depends on what you mean or what business you're in. If you're in music, pitch is the sound. In baseball, it's the flow. And if you're in sales, that's your bread and butter. Although it's also something Levinas has warned us against, or as Bernstein puts it in the preface to Pitch of Poetry, the attack or approach, the angle. Or you could just be adding a few bucks to the office pool for a nice Christmas gift for somebody, or better even to save the planet, or it's just the black stain, sticky spots like where I live in Santa Barbara, Goleta. When you walk on the beach, after you come back, you got the pitch at the bottom of your heel. That's the pitch. So in other words, how do you do translation with, given that Charles's poetry is often committed to this polysemy, so nothing tests poetry, and here's where I'm going to read a little. Nothing tests poetry harder than translation. At the same time, nothing makes poetry more alive than translation. When a poem crosses linguistic boundaries, it loses its original mooring or cohesiveness. Because cohesion, as we know, is a long concern for 20th century Anglo-American poetry and poetics, for Ezra Pound, about coherence, whether or not, his so-called notes cohere, as he will reflect upon that later in his life. Or as Charles, would say, it's not about, coherent, it's not incoherence, but coherent by other means. Words, syntaxes, and references in translation, in the process of translation, fly off in all directions like quantum dots, errant clinaments. For a poet who's devoted to polyentendre and polyvocality, Bernstein is a particularly difficult poet to translate. He acknowledged that in a lecture delivered in China on September 30th, 2011, to an audience who either had to read him in translation or found his poems in English rather daunting. And I quote, "What interests me," says Charles, "here was that no matter how formally difficult a poem is in terms of syntax or structure, and many of my poems are difficult in that way, the overriding difficulty is cultural, especially in terms of vernacular, cultural reference, and a social context. Non-standard vernacular, slang, or accented language in a poem, which is a fundamental formal device of much 20th century American poetry, loses meaning when translated for the lexical or word-for-word meaning. In the case of my work," he says, "I often distort my cultural references, making it almost impossible to look up what the original reference is, a daunting problem for the translation." Here, Charles is referring to an interesting exchange he once had with a Chinese scholar and a dear friend of mine, Zhang Zixing, who was trying to translate Bernstein's work. Puzzled by Bernstein's poems, Zhang asked him a series of questions, many of which sounded like simple requests for clarification of meaning, but actually raised fundamental questions about our understanding of poetry. If close reading, still the basic tool for literary hermeneutics, intends to contain polysemy. These questions bust the door wide open rather than, as Benjamin claims in his famous essay on translation, shut the door on language. Derived from Zhang Ziqing's probing questions, Bernstein's poem, A Test of Poetry, is a Dada ready-made, putting poetry to cardiac stress rest. In a way, Duchamp's Fountain interrogated the status of art. And here's a segment of that poem, A Test of Poetry. You write, the walls are our floors. How can the walls be floors if the floors refer to the part of the room which forms its clothing surface and upon which one walks? And the floors, like balls, repel all falls. Does balls refer to nonsense, or to any ball like a basketball, or to guys, or to a social assembly for dancing? Falls mean to descend from a higher to a lower, or to drop down wounded or dead. But what is the so-called overall mesh? Here, the questioner should not be faulted for his persistent queries into the lexical meaning of words. His genuine puzzlement is not only a testament to the aesthetics of indeterminacy, or as Marjorie Perloff once said, the art of adjacency that lies at the heart of Bernstein's work, but also to the futility of trying to fix meaning in poetry. Accuracy is the bogeyman of translation, Bernstein states. For what can be accurately paraphrased is not the poetic content of the work. In the lines in question, the walls are our only floors, and the floors like balls repel all falls. From a poem titled Fear of Flipping, the poet is more invested in the ring of echoes of wall, ball, fall, all, and even the half-rhyming repelled than the lexical meaning of these words. The ricochet of sounds and syllables, creating the titular fear of flipping, like a flip or slip of tongue, looks to walls to keep it inside or floors to hold it up. Disputes about translation are always a pretext for disputes about poetry, writes Bernstein. Translation theory is poetics by another name. If I'm interested in a certain kind of translation, it is because I'm interested in a certain kind of poetry. We know what kind of poetry Bernstein is interested in, echo poetics, regarding a poem as an echo chamber of meaning. Echo poetics is the nonlinear resonance of one motif bouncing off another within an aesthetics of constellation. Even more, it is the sensation of illusion in the absence of illusion. Echoes, then, are not merely acoustic, but elusive. The Chinese translator was not wrong trying to chase down the literal meanings of words. Does balls refer to nonsense, or to any ball like a basketball, or to guys, or to a social assembly for dancing? But the exact meaning of the word ball, like a ball, keeps on bouncing and falls into the constellation of all, fall, wall, and so on. In that echo chamber, the illusion of ball is, as Bernstein puts it, a blank, a shadow of an absent source. It's the same kind of swerving poetics one will find, for instance, in Gertrude Stein's series of chicken poems in Tender Buttons. Chicken is a peculiar third. Alas, a dirty word. Alas, a dirty third. Alas, a dirty third. Alas, a dirty bird. What it requires of a reader or a translator is, as Bernstein insists, not to seek equivalence or adjudication, but to provide responses, especially those that are hard to support rationally, like hunches, homophonic translation, close listening, or a conversation that doesn't have to stop. And I will end my remarks here, and thank you. So, and Abigail, you can take it from here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yunte, for that these great remarks on translation. I'm so glad I didn't pick topic of translation. And thank you, Paul, for your invitation and introduction. I have a few. So what I responded to the invitation to place Charles' work in both global and local context. And so I'll share my screen for just 5 minutes and then continue with remarks. But I think it's wonderful that this issue of Boundary 2 chose to focus on Charles' international reception, a fair return for his exceptional acknowledgement of non-Anglophone poetry in his books, his online projects, and his teaching. I'm quite curious to read about the reception of Charles' work in other countries and cultures, to see how he's introduced and which aspects of his writing and activities are valued or overlooked. What I can do is give you a sense of the French reception of Charles' work and the impact of his projects. So there are 3 perfectly bound volumes of Charles' poems published in French, all selections, all published over the last decade. Pied-Bot, translated by poet and translator Martin Richet, with an afterword, also featured in the forthcoming issue of Boundary 2 by poet and critic Jean-Marie Glaise, published in Olivier Brossard's excellent Collection Américaine at Jocasseria. The translation is of 2 early collections, Shade, 1978, and The Occurrence of Tune, 1981. In his afterword, Jean-Marie Glaise recalls his encounter with Charles' work, how he found in Charles' active engagement in the poetic field a confirmation of his own belief that, I quote, the landscape can be transformed. And he speaks of a feeling of brotherliness. In 2019, the Algerian publisher Apik published Pour ainsi dire, translated by poet and anthropologist Habib Tengour, with an introduction by Pierre Joris. The book appears in Tengour's Poèmes du Monde series, which aims to give Algerian readers access to contemporary world poetry in the language in which they were written and translated into French. The choice of text, adds Tengour, is the result of friendships and meetings with poet translators. In his pithy preface, Pierre Joris stresses the fact that Charles lives in New York, the richest linguistic melting pot in the world, and quotes Charles' belief that American poetry was born in second languages and is resistant to homogeneity and assimilation. Finally, Renflouer la Poésie also came out in Brossard's Collection Américaine. It contains a selection of poems which I translated over the past 15 years on the occasion of poetry readings Charles was invited to give in France. In my afterword, I focused on Charles' recent poetry and poetics to renew the view French readers might hold of his work, to complicate the somewhat monolithic image of language poetry. For Charles, work has been appearing in French magazine and anthologies since the early 80s. Language poetry first reached the French shores in 1981 when the avant-garde magazine Change ran a feature containing poems and poetic statements by 7 language poets. These poetic statements found their way in the American Tree anthology 5 years later. Language poetry loomed on the radar of French poets because a number of them had developed a keen interest in American poetry in the 1970s, after Serge Fauchereau revealed the as yet unknown richness of modern and postmodern American poetry. Jacques Roubaud, in particular, saw in the objectivist poets an alternative and an antidote to surrealism. And he saw in what he called the poets of the oral turn, featured in Don Allen's New American Poetry Anthology, a powerful solvent for the poetic solemnity and literariness plaguing French poetry. In 1980, Roubaud and Michel Deguy published an anthology consolidating the findings of Fauchereau and revaluing the modernist canon and lineage in ways strikingly similar to the language poets, demoting Eliot and Pound in favor of Stein and the objectivists, and embracing what Marjorie Perloff called, quoting Ashbery, the other tradition. This is the lineage of US poetry that has prevailed in France to this day. Shared readings and poetics sparked friendships between exact contemporaries and enabled an alliance across the Atlantic. Charles remembers meeting Claude Royer-Journoud and Emmanuel Ocar in 1978 in New York, spending the evening talking about Zhukovsky and Reznikov, and telling the French poets there were few people in New York with whom he could have had that conversation. Their go-between must have been Rosemary Waldrop, who subscribed the two French poets to Language magazine that Andrews and Bernstein started that same year, and which ran reviews of books by Anne-Marie Albiac and Royer Journoud. Charles translated poems by Royer Journoud and Albiac in the 1980s, using, perhaps pioneering, his modified homophonic approach, remaining close to the sound and word order of the original without abandoning the lexical meaning entirely. Royer Journoud and Ocar included work by Charles in the first of the two anthologies of American poetry they edited, and which offered a French take on language poetry, a decentered and unfamiliar take, as Lynn Hedginian remarked. 10 years later, Charles was invited as a speaker at what appears to have been the first conference on the objectivist, convened by Ocar at the Abbaye de Royaumont. Charles gave a salient talk on Reznikov's poetry, later published in an expanded version in My Way. The Royaumont Conference decisively sealed an alliance between French and American poets of the same generation, poets sharing a similar reading of modernity, au fait with theory and post-structural philosophy, committed to formal experimentation, and determined not to speak the same language as Auschwitz. This was an alliance against the reactionary backlash that set in the 80s in poetry as in other fields. And so I'll stop sharing my screen and continue. That same year, 1989, Bernstein and Hedginian went on a reading tour through Paris and Marseille as the first guest of Un Bureau sur l'Atlantique, which translates as a desk across the Atlantic or facing the Atlantic. A singular non-profit organization started by Ocar and aiming, I quote, to improve the knowledge of contemporary American poetry in France and promote exchanges between American and French poets, end of quote. Although Ocar had himself founded a small press in '69, he had been struck by his American counterparts' capacity for creating venues for their work. Reading series like The Ear In, founded by Charles and Ted Greenwald, radio shows, or Bernadette Mayer's workshops at the Poetry Project. Having himself benefited from the encounters and instigations offered by such circumstances, Ocar set out to create them for other poets, generalizing and institutionalizing them, opening up the circle of potential addressees. Ocar went on to set up the first major poetry reading series at Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris, to organize translation workshops at the Abbaye de Royaumont, and he later taught at an art school in Bordeaux. Charles was exceptionally responsive to the Bureau's endeavor and instrumental in setting up a West Deck on the East Coast. In the 1990s, he partnered with the Waldrops at Brown and with Serge Gavronsky at Barnard College to hold an annual French Poetry Festival, and he brought a dozen French poets to Buffalo for readings and talks, fueling an interest in French poetry in several of his students. I don't know whether Charles and Emmanuel ever discussed this, but it strikes me they share a commitment to organizing as a poetic practice, to quote Charles' formula. Both sought to open up forums for collective reflection in ever-widening circles. In Charles' case, those circles widened from private correspondence to Language magazine, the Erin reading series, the Poetics program at SUNY Buffalo, the UB Poetics list, Electronic Poetry Center, and Penn Sound. In hindsight, the internet proved the adequate means to carry out Ocar's transnational impulse and weave a non-national context. Symptomatically, the archive of Un Bureau sur l'Atlantique are housed at EPC, and until recently, the only place you could hear a recording of Royer Journoud was on Penn Sound. It's hard to overstate what we owe Charles, hard to imagine where we would be without EPC and Penn Sound, and partner sites such as Jacket 2, published by Alfred Rees, especially those of us trying to keep abreast of contemporary North American poetry from abroad. In addition to the compelling force of his creative and critical work and of his educational propositions, there is a lot that I have to thank Charles for. I found permission and encouragement to expand the tone range of scholarly writing. I plundered his syllabi for ideas and references. I downloaded innumerable files from Penn Sound for teaching and research, I promoted close listening with my students and convinced colleagues in French literature that we needed the equivalent of pen sound for poetry in French, with all files freely downloadable. Free access is a decisive feature that Charles' projects retained as they grew and become institutionalized. The other is personality. As large as these sites have become, they retain a personal dimension in their curatorial approach, avoiding the polar pitfalls of coterie and impersonality, personal and therefore accountable. Widening the conversation and intensifying personality, this is also what Charles' poetry has increasingly done, giving growing importance to translation and taking translation in an expanding sense, not just from one language to another, but also from one medium to another, text to speech, speech to text, performing, scoring, transcribing, accenting, to include all manners of versioning, repurposing, adaptations, and covers and tributes, thickening the texture, layering the medium, superimposing masks. Hence the presence of Pessoa, the Portuguese poet with over 70 heteronyms in the recent works. Topsy Turvy includes a poem written at Pessoa's grave, pondering the impossible identity with oneself. Complicating identity, these masks are also listening to the dead, reanimating the past, breathing the literal meaning with Catullus, to quote Zukowski's preface to his and Celia Zukowski's translations of the Roman poet, or with Charles' very own Roman poet, Claudio Amberian, or with Esteban Purals, who sounds very much like Zukowski's Catullus in Topsy Turvy, non-slow, sufficient mint, levitates, last falls, doze, nuts. These are lines to sound aloud. So I will end by thanking Charles once again for doubling our pleasure with offering us Topsy Turvy in print and as an audiobook, a stereophonic experience I strongly recommend. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you, Abigail. Runa, can you hear us?
I'm very thankful to you all for giving me a chance to join in this poetry meet, to share my views on Charles Bernstein. My first interaction with Bernstein started during my anthology project, Visible Lines, an anthology of borderless world poetry in Bengali. That I co-edited and transcreated in 2018 with 12 American poets, including Mimi Barsenbragi, Murat Nimit Nejat, Elizabeth Willis, Peter Kitchell, etc. But long back, I read Charles Bernstein poem, Thinking, I Think, I Think, in 2003. That was quoted by Barin Ghoshal in his long essay about language poetry movement, which was collected in his book, Future of Poetry. Barin Ghoshal was a poet, a Bengali poet, theorist, critic, and the originator of the Kaurav literary movement. With reference to Kaurav movement, started by Barin Ghoshal, he discussed the language poets like Bernstein, Bruce Andrews, Fanny Way, Steve McVitie's The Materiality of Language Against Commodification, then Ron Silliman's Disappearance of the Word, Appearance of the World, then Experiment by Bernadette Mayer, mini manual of poetry writing. Then Abigail Child's Units of Unmeaningness Incorporated Anew versus Community of Sloganians, etc. In early 90s, Barin introduced a new literary theory, expansive consciousness, in the world of Bengali poetry. In his critically acclaimed book on expansive consciousness that was published in 1996, the theory is similar to cubism, but not to stop at the surface level, but to expand beyond the dark outer space of matter towards infinity. It is an enlightened journey, centrifugal journey with outstepping in unknown darkness. I would say that the theory cohere with the concept of conscious imagination of Bernstein's poetic patagonicalism. With this theory, Barin started a new genre in Bengali poetry, which he named as Notun Kobita, New Poetry. I marveled at the way Barin started Kaurav literary movement in 1969 with the similar issues in language poetry against fetishization of meaning of words, politics of reference in Steve McFadden's sense. Even when there was no communication of facility of internet in India. I don't call these as similarity, but a kind of quantum coherence between the voices, process, thoughts of different poets with different language in different zones of the world, time zone of the world. When I started reading Bernstein's speech of poetry, I was amazed by the new poetics, patagonicalism, where I found a kind of coherence with the poetics of Barin Husserl. I felt the importance of sharing Bernstein's poetics in Bengali poetic zone and started writing different essays and translation of his poems, essays for Bengali fans. Finally, in June 2020, I started the transcription project for his essay, The Patagonical Imagination, Fantasy in 140 Feet, with commentary both in Bengali and English, under the heading, Welcome to the Patagonical Night Show. It was published in online magazine, and so far 5 episodes have been launched, not yet completed. The boundary to journal with its different issues gave me a sense of going beyond, as its name suggests. And its critical inquiry into the study of contemporary literature echoes the queer inquiry of patagonical imagination. That also I feel like cohere with the editor Paul Bové's concept of imaginative intelligence, as he explored in Rambo's Bathsaga in his latest book, Love Shadow. Kaurav magazine, the print magazine is edited by Kamal Chakraborty now, and Kaurav webzine that was started in 1998. It is edited by Arjunil Mukhopadhyay. I remember one wonderful interview of Charles that was taken by Arjunil Mukhopadhyay for the webzine. The naming of Kaurav reminds me that Wallace Stevens' aesthetic of evil, where evil is an inspirational motive for the imaginary world of a poet. Kaurav has a image of Satan in our epic Mahabharata, where Kaurava fought against Pandava, dedicated to preserve and uphold dharma, the religious authority. That is to say that Kaurav was the evil to the established cultural norms of the Bengali institutions. This indeed echoes Bernstein's 12-year universal horoscope in Topsy, Turvy, where he quoted, "The seraph is Satyr in Saturn." that was quoted from Notes Towards the Supreme Fiction by Wallace Stevens. This supremacy of poetry lies in the fact that it is unknowable by mind, intellect, senses, in the objective sense, but it is knowable through direct intuitive perception, through mental alertness. I would say that this echoes Bernstein's poem Effigy from his Near Miss, where he writes, my poetry is not conceptual but inconceivable. It is inconceivable because it is not a sense object. It is the subject, the vision itself. So it is conceivable by mental attainment that leads towards the complete freedom to go beyond the logical barrier. That is to say that to shift the awareness from the rational mode to the intuitive mode of consciousness. Actually, our intellect always wants to locate the poetic imagination, but in its very nature, that imagination cannot be limited. Finally, I would like to share my personal experience with Charles. It has built my concept that he is a true professor, not only in university, but also in real life, who profess an aesthetics that he writes in Topsy Turvy, aesthetics that turns an otherworldly eye to family, nation, community, and rationality. I don't see aesthetic only in terms of language, in terms of literature, poetry, but of life. Our Sanskrit etymology says that aesthetics, the pleasure of mind, the source of infinite joy. Of course, joy includes intense impulse of pain, because pain is not an opposite entity, but an inseparable part of joy. It is Charles' every sincere response to my essays, to my all queries during my working with his work, always open up multiple possibilities of my thoughts. Even his pun, his sarcasm, sometimes triggers me to write bizarre essays instead of writing conventional reviews of the books. I could remember my experience of writing Beware of the Ast essay, to counter his poem 12-year Universal Horoscope from Topsy Turvy. His every prediction, every suggestion as astrologer used to trigger my wild imagination to counter them with all my nonsense argument. I would say nonsense argument, but again, nonsense is the key to sense in Alice in Wonderland world. I remember Bernstein's speeches in his speech of poetry, stumbling clumsiness of one, the eloquence of the gods for another. My clumsy arguments might have not conveyed anything to reader, but it really took me to cloud nine. I could never forget the psychic experience I had throughout the period of writing the essay. I would say that the meaning of Bernstein's favorite word, internet, was revealed to me. It reminds me the poetic citizenship, what Bernstein talked about in Topsy Turvy, in his poem, Poetic Citizenship and Negative Dialectics. This Bernstein's province has a negative economy in Adorno's sense, what he termed as exchange economy. that creates a democratic social space between a poet and a reader. Where I feel my mental comfort when Charles writes that citizenship that refuses dialogue with the delirious, wanton, discomforting possibilities of poetry approaches nativism.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you.
Well, shall I just to continue with Runa? Runa, can you hear me? I'm not. One thing that those in this audience might not realize is that she can't actually hear. But we were planning to read the poem. You want to? Maybe she read it first. Runa? Maybe not.
Covidity. Shall I read now?
Yes, you read that first, because I think just while we have the continuity. So this is Covidity from Topsy Turvy that she's translated. Yeah.
You will read first or shall I read?
No, you go.
Covidity. কোভিড আমায় বুঝতে পারছে, এখন যদি নাও পারে একদিন বুঝবে। কোভিড আমায় মারবে, যেখানেই থাকি খুঁজে বের করবেই। আবরণে ঢেকে হল ঘরে আশ্রয়, বন্ধু বিদায় লেনদেন সব হতচ্ছাড়া 15 ফুট দেয়াল বেয়ে। কোভিড আমায় বুঝবে ঠিকই, কলজে আমার দুর্বল আর সকলেই বোঝে ভুল। আমি সামাজিক দূরত্ব অভ্যাস করি, এমনকি বেঢপ মুখোশে নিজেকে ঢাকি। মনে হয় যেন লোন রেঞ্জার, হাততালি পাওয়ার একটু। কোভিড আমায় খুঁজে পাবেই, আর যদি নাও পায় সময় মতো পাবেই। কোভিড আমার পিছনে পড়েছে, ঠিক খুঁজে নেবে কোথায় আমি। তুমি বলো সামাজিক দূরত্ব, আমি আত্মার কষ্ট বলি। তুমি বলো এ আমি বইতে পারি, কিন্তু এ বোঝা ভীষণ ভারী। কোভিড খুব কাছে, আমায় চাপকাবে অনির্দিষ্টকাল, কিন্তু তাতে আমার মাথা ব্যথা নয়, তোমারই জন্য ভয়। তুমি সদাই থাকো দূরে, কিন্তু আমার থেকে নয়। এখন মনে হয় তুমি ভেসে চলেছ অনেক দূরের কোনো সমুদ্রে। কোভিড আমায় বুঝতে পারছে, এখন না হলেও কোনো একদিন কোভিড জানতে পেরেছে আমি ঠিক কোথায় থাকি। তুমি বলো সামাজিক দূরত্ব, আমি ঠিক সামলে নেব, কাজে লাগাবো। কিন্তু তোমার থেকে দূরে যখন সাঁতরে ওঠার আগেই ডুবে যাব। কোভিড আমায় বুঝতে পারছে, এখন যদি নাও পারে খুব শিগগির। কোভিড আমায় জাগিয়ে রাখে বিষণ্ণতায় সারা রাত। এত মৃত্যু চারপাশে, হাল ছেড়ে গেছে প্রায়। কেবলই তোমায় ডাকছি টেলিফোনে, কিন্তু তুমি মগ্ন স্কাইপে। কোভিড আসছে, বোকা বানাবে নিশ্চিত। কলজে আমাদের দুর্বল, আর সকলেই বোঝে ভুল।
Thank you so much. You know, I'll just say something. It's so great that you're able to do this, because we had some connection problems, and I know it's very early in the morning or late at night in India, and of course, I also know that as we all do, watching the problem with COVID in India is so severe right now. So this poem, tries to acknowledge that. I thought really the keeping of the Lone Ranger in English was like the punctum. I don't think that was Barth's sense of what the punctum is, but it's like a punch in the middle of the poem. It's very, I was interested in how the rhythm would go. So here it is in its, in the American version. Covidity. The COVID gonna get me. If not now, it will. The COVID gonna kill me. Find me where I live. Buried under covers, sheltered in the hall. trading goodbyes to all my friends through goddamn 15-foot walls. The COVID will get me bad. My lungs are weak and I am much misunderstood. I practice social distance, even got an oversized mask, feel like the Lone Ranger before he got the clap. The COVID gonna find me, if not today, in time. The COVID after me, find exactly where I am. Call it social distance. I call it pain in the soul. You say I can handle it, but it's too heavy a load. The COVID round the corner will thrash me till I blue. But that's not my worry. Terrified for you. You've always been distant, but not from me. Now I feel you're drifting like you're far out at sea. The COVID gonna get me if not now, any day. The COVID got my number, knows just where I stay. You say I'll manage social distance, that I can make it work. But if I'm distant from you, I'm sunk before I swum. The COVID gonna get me. If not now, soon. The COVID has me up all night, fighting against all this gloom. Too much death surrounding. I darn near given up. Keep calling on the telephone, but you're hung up on Skype. The COVID coming, sure to get us good. Our lungs are weak, and we are much misunderstood. So, Paul, you want to say some words?
I thought I would ask if others had questions of each other first. I'm not actually supposed to be a person who speaks here, Charles.
Oh, but I'm asking.
Abigail, yes.
I'll ask Yunte what his translator friend, how did he translate Wall in the end?
It came out, pretty much the way Charles describes, providing the context. And certainly it's a, as we all know, translation is really, has very little rewards in the sense of you have fun along the way, but that's all you're gonna get. I think the pain and the fun. That's But I have a question for Charles. Is that in what language you sound the best? You think?
Anyone but my own.
I see.
That translation that Yunte refers to, A Test of Poetry, and you can go online. I think on my Jacket 2 page, I have 5 or 6 different translations of it. I mean, they were originally questions from this Chinese translator of a book that Yunte did. So if we did for China really what Abigail did for France, but a completely different situation, still there was an early book called, what was it called, Language Poetry? James Sherry, and it was Hank Lazar and me, that Yunte did with this very distinguished, perhaps the most distinguished scholar of American literature. So, but I was fascinated by the detail in his questions. And one interesting thing, which I think is so clear, and then we sort of met right around that time in the early 90s when you came to Buffalo. I mean, that poem is very funny, as many of my things are, just as the COVIDity poem is funny, but we know that COVID is horrifying and filled with sadness and grief and death. In the case of the translation, though, I mean, it was pointed out to me immediately by John Cayley, who's now at Brown, but is also a Chinese translator, that it had created a problem. I don't know how anybody could have heard about it in China for this distinguished scholar, because they thought I was saying that his translation wasn't accurate. So I was amazed to hear this actually in London, in a bar reading, John said, I've heard about this thing, and you have to realize that that's the way it's being interpreted. And I added a note, and that note is very important to, in a way, what we're all saying here, what I share with my friends, and I'm so happy to have you all here. In the note that in the version that's in my way, I say that this was one of the best criticisms, one of the best modes of thinking about my work that I had seen. I mean, very much in the sense of the critical intelligence that Runa quotes from Paul Bové in his book Love Shadow. We're looking at what the long time relationship of art to criticism, where translation becomes so important. And so it was a celebration of what he had done, because, like, as you said, with the balls, the multiple sense of it opened up beyond what I could even do as a poet. He was like taking that poem beyond what I was able to do in the English. And to me, it was a celebration, not in any way a criticism. And I think, we became friends after, and I think that explanation worked, but it has a lot to do with what we're talking about here and this wonderful experience of being with you. So first, let me say it, Paul may or may not talk about this, but we had the idea of doing this issue as being non-US centered. And then, of course, this is a tiny example, and I want to acknowledge out there, because I could see some of the participants, two of the other contributors, Ian Probstein, who did a translation of work in Russian, and who is a person I'm in touch with, many times each week, and we're both in New York. I have a lively conversation, and another New York friend, Luigi Ballerini, who starts out the issue from Los Angeles, New York, and from Milan. I think Luigi and Ian are out there. Originally Jan, so I want to say hello to them. I don't really know how it would read to anybody else. In this issue, there are a lot of interviews that I did that were translated. For example, the Habib Tengor that Abigail Lang mentions. He did an interview with me that's in this issue, and actually Pierre Joris's forward to that book is also in this, translated into English for the first time. In many cases, things that were, for me, written in English, but published in translation. So to bring these dialogues with people in many different places together, and then to kind of shift the frame of the conversation as today out of the US. It's not that I'm not, as American as the next guy. In fact, I would say I'm more American than the next guy, especially you, Joe, and Bill. I'm a lot more American than you. But even so, and I'm deeply engaged with seeing things within the context of US political space and of the history of American literature and literature in English in America, and also English literature. But still, there's something else that interests me, and I don't really know whether it's possible, and I well understand the problems. And with Runa, it's fascinating when she started to write to me, and she was writing these, and you can read them. The number of them are already online, and the one that's going to be in Boundary too. She was taking not only stuff from the tradition that the specific poetic work of the last 30 years that I knew a little bit about, and Brian Gosel and how that connects up. But that's one thing that's an interesting dialogue, because that dialogue never existed. When you're talking about France, you have a well-documented couple of 100 years of interaction, and Abigail's book, as you can see from her talk, is extraordinary in its detail. With West Bengali and American poetry, I don't have much information about what that interaction is, and it hasn't been anything like that. But she's also integrating it within Vedic thought and Sanskrit and other kinds of things. So it's not my giving my relationship to Eastern thought, which has been an important tradition within American poetry, and sometimes fraught with problems. Everything is fraught with problems, but it's kind of the other way around. She has one thing about the kind of Jewish karma, which I love, into the context that she's in, and that's is really incredible experience for me. So, you know, for one thing, it's an experiment in some way, what it would be like to read that stuff. And Paul was extraordinary in reading through all of this stuff that nobody had actually ever seen except me. And say, well, I kept wondering what you would think when you saw some of the things that you were looking at, including Runa. And now to have Runa with us is sort of an amazing experience. It was like a dream to have Runa, you know, in fact, to have some of these Zoom things that were, you know, went a little bit beyond our US horizon, and to think about what poetry could be. And I'm not going to get into this. And we want to, and I'm going to stop in a second, because I fully recognize the problems of this non-national frame. I'm not saying this is what poetry is, and all of a sudden it's filled with problems, but the problems are interesting to me. And they're political problems, ideological problems, of course, of colonialization, of hegemony, counter-hegemony. You don't get away with any of that stuff in terms of translation and the poetics of translation. And I think all three of my great friends here, Yunte and Abigail and Runa, really are talking about that. But the interesting thing is, you could see with the person I know most recently, Runa, I mean, she started to talk. And I hope that those of you listening and seeing Runa for the first time realize, she could be here, right in the room with me and having a dinner and talking about the kind of issues of poetics. So like I said to my friends Claude and Emmanuel, when they started to talk about Charles Reznikov and Louis Zukowski, there's nobody in New York hardly. I mean, I had friends, that connected to language and so on, who love those poets, but that was what was intimate to them. There's a kind of intimacy to conversations which go beyond the national frame with that are possible. And when you hear Runa speaking, you can see, well, yeah, these are things that I'm thinking about too. But of course, they are coming from a very asymmetric place, as many people have written about. But Abigail mentioned, and then I'm going to stop, At Pessoa's Grave. It's such a short poem. And I wrote it when I was actually a year and a half ago, At Pessoa's Grave. Good title. It's the actual where I was. It's very, very short. I'm not me, nor you, neither we, but all's found in them's they. So maybe that's the answer to Yunte's question in the beginning, which what language do I like the best?
I think we have a question in the audience.
Yes, it's from Rob Wilson.
Okay, Rob.
Rob.
How you doing, Rob? Old time Boundary 2 guy.
Since like 1991. How many years is that? My God. Anyway, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we don't see you. We see your name.
Oh, okay. I got to put the visual weight.
You all noticed that Runa has my name. We were going to do it all topsy-turvy and everybody different names, but it was too complicated. But next time we'll do it that way.
I could change everyone to Bernstein if you like.
No, on the contrary, that's not. I want the opposite. Maybe that's the problem. That's what I'm afraid of. Exactly. I think Paul is exactly. It's what I'm afraid of, but pretending is not true.
So Rob is muted.
You can hear me now, right?
Yes. Yeah.
But anyway, sorry about that. But
that's okay.
I just finished a 4-hour session on Zoomlandia from Duke, so I'm a little zoomed out. But anyway, I appreciate this, and I'm glad I'm here. And I appreciate the risk and the adventure of the global outreach and the ties to Paris, to India, to the Sinosphere, etc. I have 2 questions for Charles that kind of haunt me a little bit, and I'm sure you've already pondered them in your essays or in your interviews. But one is Glissant's idea of opacity, and the other is the idea of an idiolect. And Glissant, in the Poetics of Relation in the French Caribbean, now he defends the idea, what he calls the right to opacity. And he means by that a kind of creolized French and the kind of sense that a peripheral difference, that you can't translate it into a metropolitan language, and he refuses to. So I'm wondering what, and kind of the language poet embrace of opacity, what it meant in the late 70s doesn't mean the same thing now. And you might not even want to embrace opacity in this context. But the other thing is whether you see yourself as an idiomatic poet, or I kind of remember you used the term idiolect.
Idiolect with an E,
Almost like
IDEO, yeah.
a singularity of language that
Mhm.
refuses universal translation, that sort of like embraces a kind of peculiarity of diction, of moire, of language. The Pessoa poem is a little bit like that, but it's like a mysterious haiku that you kind of could crack the code on it. So it's not totally opaque, but I wonder if you could comment on those things.
Well, I will, but I'm just as interested to hear any of the other folks comment. It's interesting to see that emergence associated with glissant of the term opacity. So I'm glad that you note, and I admire that book by Glissant and Glissant's work, and very connected to his thinking. But indeed, that was probably my one of the most frequently used words in the 1970s that I would have used for my work. And I do think it's connected. I don't think it's the same. And I think Glissant has a different connection to it. But I think especially in the Poetics of the Americas and Objectivist Blues, the two essays where I interpret this concept of idiolectical, IDEO, I try to talk about it in a context that's, though I don't talk about Glissant, but I do talk about it in a context that's comparable to Glissant and also with Caribbean poetry. So I can't give it without going into too much length here, because I'm already speaking more than I had in mind. I would say that it remains absolutely crucial to understand opacity, because it allows us to have certain kinds of exchanges, and that you have the exchange with the acknowledgement of opacity. And I think marked in each of the three presentations today, you could hear what that was. I mean, I think Yunte directly addresses that in a sense in his longer essay too, and he and I have long talked about that, and the way in which he also deals with Chinese U.S. interactions. I think when Runa is talking about the horoscope piece, when you can read that wonderful, which is a piece that's in Topsy Turvy, she does this long riff on the horoscope. She extends it, but I mean, the horoscope itself has a kind of a opacity to what it is, but it deals with opacity in the way that Yunte talks about in his Charlie Chan book, and what we share, that kind of aphorism. So the horoscope piece really picks up on a certain kind of non-national aphoristic dimension that goes wild. If we turn this over to Abigail, she could talk at length about the connection between the aspects of opacity as a literary term, as a term of poetic art, in terms of the French poetry that I feel is very connected with, in terms of my friends, but also the connection, especially to Zhukovsky, which was, of course, so much resisted. And it should talk about Zhukovsky. Just been talking with Dominique Foucault, my great friend, about kind of Zhukovsky versus Oppen on this very question of opacity, because of, on the face of it, Oppen spoke about, was in opposition. And by the way, at that conference, so was Rákosi in 1989. Rákosi was not sympathetic to Reznikov, but surely Hocquart and Henri Albiac and Claude Rey-Journeau were. And so they were interested in something like the opacity. But I would say part of the opacity in Reznikov has to do with his Jewishness, his connection to Yiddish, his second language quality. So it always has a cultural dimension. Now, I've already spoken much longer than I wanted, and we're going to stop in a couple of minutes, right, Paul? We don't want to go beyond 1 hour and 15 minutes.
I don't see any other hands up at this time. Does anybody else want to say anything? Well, I would love to stay on and talk for an hour or two, but we don't have the time for that, I'm afraid. I've been reading Topsy Turvy and a lot of Charles's other work, of course, over the last 15 months with a particular intensity. And it's been an education, as they would say. Those of us who talk about Henry Adams would say it's been an education. It's keeping with the theme of the day, I suppose what I would say has struck me, and this is what's been so interesting in assembling an issue from many more pieces of interview and translation and so on than we were able to publish in the journal. What's been so interesting to me is the way in which Charles has actually become the center of a global node of imaginative function. I mean, people can speak of this in terms of person and language, but let's think of it in terms of possibilities of exchange, of network building, of the way in which this immensely complicated work has become also, through translation, a point of interaction among people here from France across the eastern United States to the western United States to Bengal and elsewhere. And this is metonymic, it seems to me, of the way in which the work of a poet builds not only by the texts on his own page, if I can say, but by his interactions, exchanges, readers, commentators, invitations, even corrections and additions, right? Builds an entire imaginative world, which has impressed me in listening today in particular, has really come to form and occupy the minds and imaginations of other people as well. So the what could be called simply influence is far more than that. It seems to me it's if we didn't want it to sound terrible, we would say that as a result of Charles, many of us are infect, right? But we have been infected by the possibilities that are not necessarily his alone, right? That are at work in that poetry as a function of language, as a function of this particular historical moment, the culture of performance upon which so much of that work riffs. I wonder too how much of the riffing depends upon the exportation of US culture, the capitalization of various norms, which, although it may not make particular words familiar, makes rhythms familiar, makes the idea that there can be a language that looks like advertising familiar. So that's one thing. A few weeks ago, and this is to pick up the COVIDity theme again, I'm sorry, and then I'll stop since we've just hit our limit of time. Like many other people, a few weeks ago, I had a number of deaths around me. And I was rereading Topsy Turvy, and I wrote to Charles saying that I had, on that weekend, read book 4, Last Kind Words. And this is something I think we probably haven't talked enough about, and we could. And that is what happens when readers encounter this work. But I was reading in the midst of mourning, intense personal mourning over that weekend, the poems there, and I thought, well, you know, this is a tradition that runs through Lycidas to many other places. So we forget, I think, sometimes with the sheer brilliance of what's happening here, the aesthetic efficacy. If I can use the word aesthetic in this particular context without being too criticized for it, but the aesthetic efficacy, right, of organizing people's lives, of intersecting the psyches and the imaginations of readers as well, and making not just a great deal of what is contemporary, but also remaking. Here's the eco-poetics theme, which Yunte mentioned early on, but making and remaking from what we all know and what has been inherited, something that not only is new, but is new in a form of revitalization. And interestingly, when you have someone translate into a language which is not the poet's own, or even close to the poet's own, then those echoes and eco-poetics from Catullus pass into Bengal via Bernstein. And you have these wonderful forms of what I'll call simple political terms and drop it for a moment, a kind of counter-globalization effort. Anyway, let me stop.
I thank you so much for that, Paul, because it's you really pick up on a lot of the problems as much as the possibilities. And I'm equally interested in the problems. And English is a hegemonic world language. I mean, and I'm aware of the fact that part of the reason I'm able to to be read in different places that people know English, but it's also, we won't lose the fact that languages that we speak as poets, including English, are not the same as beloved popular culture and popular movies, or even great English language theoretical or philosophical works. And there's something different about this kind of exchange. And
I find in the way in which you often cite, without noticing, without signifying that you're citing, rhythms, lines, and phrases from literatures which are not contemporary but older, that non-hegemonic elements of English and American literature are returned, they're recovered. And they have a kind of counter effect upon the hegemonic contemporaneity of English in the market. So the function of memory, too, seems to me to be displacing as well as augmenting, across and through the mechanism of English, which here's another terrible word, which almost in heroic fashion, you're trying to master as it plays across its possibilities in the wit and comedy and inversion, as well as memory and citation of what's come before. But there's a book to be written, somebody says, about.
Well, I'm very glad you spoke, and it also gives me the chance to thank you, not for this issue, but also before that, for your work in Boundary too, because I know I won't be able to necessarily do this in public, which this is. You're going to step down as the editor in a couple of years, and it's been a long time. I first came to Boundary through Bill Spanos, who did the great issues on Olson, Spicer, Creeley, and others, and Anton in those early issues. And then we kind of came into, you're more directly involved at that time, but nonetheless, we have been working together for decades on Boundary too. And it's just been a fantastic space for me. And in fact, the second of the two full issues that I did was 99 Poets, 1999. And that was an earlier envisioning of something like I was trying to do here. And at the very same time that Boundary 2 itself was moving out of a US centered, and not just Boundary 2, but many ways to think about, I'm saying non-US rather than global, because for reasons many of you will understand, but decentering the US and thinking about the relationship of those of us in America to other parts of the world, north, south, east, west, for example. So it was great to then work with you this past year on this issue, which comes out in the fall, and then you're doing this event for Topsy Turvy. And once again, Abigail, Yunte, Runa, I'm so happy to be here virtually with you all.
Let me thank everyone also for staying up late, waking up early, as the case may be. Thank Charles centrally, of course, not only for taking the time to do this while he's sitting in Eden, but also spending the last 18 months or so receiving a steady barrage of editorial queries from me and my editorial staff, and wrestling with the Duke University Press lawyers to the point of near exhaustion at times to get this issue out. So thank you all very, very much. It's fabulous to hear you and to see you all again, and Runa, to meet you for the first time. So thank you. So I'm going to sign off. This will be in edited form sometime soon, reposted on the B2 YouTube channel. Thanks again to everyone. And good night, good morning, good evening, bonsoir, bonjour, etc. Bye-bye.